Welcome to Black Power Stories, where every story reminds us that true justice always finds its way. If you believe everyone deserves dignity, fairness, and respect, you're in the right place. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. The truth doesn't need permission to change everything in a single moment. And on a quiet morning in downtown Chicago, that truth was already moving faster than anyone could understand. A breaking news alert flashed across multiple screens inside a local newsroom. The city had just been ordered to pay a $4.7 million settlement in a case that no one saw coming, tied to an incident that began at nothing more than an ordinary bus stop. No sirens, no chaos, no dramatic headlines at first, just a single encounter that quietly unraveled into something much larger than anyone involved could have predicted. But before the cameras, before the legal statements, before the city tried to explain itself, there was a moment in time that no report could fully capture, a moment that started 72 hours earlier on a cold morning where the sky was gray and the streets felt unusually still. At a worn-down bus stop near 8th Avenue, people stood waiting in silence, bundled in jackets, checking their phones, lost in their routines, until a woman named Aaliyah Carter stepped into view. She didn't announce herself. She didn't draw attention. She simply stood there with calm patience, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, as if she was used to waiting in places where the world rarely paid attention. Most people passing by would have seen nothing remarkable, just another commuter blending into the rhythm of the city. But what they didn't see was the quiet precision in the way she observed everything around her, the subtle awareness that came from years of working inside systems most people never truly understood. A few blocks away, Deputy Ryan Miller had already started his shift with the kind of attitude that came from routine and assumption, the belief that most situations could be categorized quickly, handled efficiently, and cleared without complication. When his patrol car slowed near the bus stop, his attention locked onto Aaliyah almost immediately, not because of anything she did, but because of something unspoken in the way she stood alone, calm, and seemingly out of place in his judgmental frame of reference. He stepped out, adjusting his uniform, scanning the area as if searching for justification rather than truth. The morning air felt heavier as he approached, his tone carrying the weight of authority that often went unchallenged in small moments like these. Aaliyah turned slightly as he came closer, acknowledging his presence without urgency, her eyes steady but distant in a way that suggested she had already assessed the situation long before he spoke. Around them, the city continued moving, unaware that a simple exchange was about to shift the direction of everything that followed. Miller's questions came quick, procedural at first, then sharper, shaped by suspicion rather than evidence, while Aaliyah remained composed, offering only what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less. It was not resistance that defined her silence, but control, a quiet discipline that often unsettled people who expected emotion to fill the gaps. The bus stop, once ordinary and unnoticed, began to feel different, as if the air itself had tightened around the moment, holding its breath without explanation. And in that stillness, neither of them realized that what was unfolding was not just an interaction between an officer and a commuter, but the first visible thread in a chain of events that would eventually reach far beyond the corner of that street, into courtrooms, federal offices, and a number that would later be repeated across every headline in the city, for $0.7 million, the cost of a moment no one had understood while it was happening. The morning air in downtown Chicago carried a strange kind of stillness, the kind that feels ordinary until you look back and realize it was the exact moment everything began to change. At the bus stop on 8th Avenue, commuters continued their routines as if nothing unusual was happening, phones in hand, eyes distant, waiting for transportation that would take them to jobs, meetings, and obligations that defined their day. Aaliyah Carter remained where she was, calm and composed, her presence blending into the environment in a way that made her easy to overlook. Yet there was a quiet awareness in her posture, a subtle attentiveness that never fully relaxed. She was not rushing, not distracted, simply present in a way that suggested patience was not unfamiliar to her. A few feet away, Deputy Ryan Miller stood watching her through the lens of habit and assumption, his attention shaped less by what he saw and more by what he expected to find. He adjusted his stance, scanning the surroundings once again as if the setting itself could justify his growing suspicion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the practiced firmness of authority, asking questions that arrived before understanding had a chance to form. Aaliyah turned toward him without hesitation, her response measured, her tone steady, offering only what was necessary to acknowledge his presence without feeding the uncertainty in his approach. The exchange remained outwardly simple, but beneath it, something more delicate was forming, a tension built not from aggression, but from imbalance, from the quiet friction between perception and reality. As other commuters shifted in their places, some glancing briefly toward the interaction before returning to their phones, the bus stop began to feel smaller, as if the space itself was tightening around the two of them. Miller's focus intensified, his questions becoming more pointed, circling around assumptions rather than facts, while Aaliyah remained unchanged, her composure holding steady like a constant line through shifting pressure. There was no urgency in her movements, no attempt to fill the silence with unnecessary explanation, only a calm presence that contrasted sharply with the rising insistence in his tone. A passing bus rumbled by, briefly drowning out the moment, but when it moved on, the silence returned heavier than before. Miller took another step closer, his posture rigid, his attention fixed as though narrowing the situation would somehow bring clarity. Aaliyah met his gaze directly, her expression unreadable, neither challenging nor yielding, simply observing. Around them, the city continued to function, unaware that this small interaction was beginning to separate itself from everything ordinary, forming the early shape of something that would not remain contained within a single sidewalk or a single conversation. And in that quiet intersection of suspicion and restraint, neither of them could have known that the next few minutes would begin to reveal that what looked like an ordinary encounter was already connected to forces far beyond the reach of that street corner, forces that would soon draw attention from offices, records, and authorities that operated at an entirely different level. The moment between Deputy Ryan Miller and Aaliyah Carter at the bus stop had begun to shift in a way that neither of them fully acknowledged, as if the air itself had subtly changed its weight. The city around them remained active, buses passing at intervals of a few minutes, pedestrians moving in clusters, each person absorbed in their own direction, unaware that a small interaction was beginning to gather consequences far beyond its visible boundaries. Aaliyah stood in the same place she had been since the conversation began, her posture steady, her attention measured, giving nothing away beyond what was required in the moment. Ryan Miller, however, had begun to close the distance between observation and conclusion, his questions becoming more direct, shaped by a certainty that had not yet been tested against fact. There was no outward escalation in volume, no dramatic change in tone, only a gradual tightening of focus that made the space between them feel increasingly narrow. A passing commuter slowed briefly, noticing the interaction, then continued walking, while another glanced from a nearby bench before looking away, as though instinctively choosing not to become involved. Aaliyah's expression remained composed, her responses precise, offering clarity without excess, as if she understood that sometimes silence carried more weight than explanation. Miller checked something on his device, then returned his attention to her, his stance rigid, his authority asserted through presence rather than action, but still unmistakably directed. The morning light reflected off the pavement in soft tones, casting long shadows that shifted as people moved through the stop, and in that shifting light, the contrast between perception and reality began to feel more pronounced. Aaliyah adjusted her position slightly, not in response to pressure, but in a natural continuation of waiting, yet even that small movement seemed to draw Miller's attention further, as if he were determined to assign meaning where none had been given. The surrounding noise of the city continued uninterrupted, but within the immediate space, there was a growing sense of isolation, as though the bus stop had separated itself from the rest of the street. Miller's voice returned with renewed insistence, asking for confirmation, clarification, something that would settle the uncertainty he had begun to construct around her presence. Aaliyah answered without hesitation, her tone unchanged, her calmness steady, but the exchange no longer felt balanced. It was no longer simply a question and response, but a process of interpretation on one side and restraint on the other. As another bus approached in the distance, its engine sound growing louder before slowing to a stop nearby. The brief interruption momentarily shifted attention away from them, but when the doors opened and closed and the bus moved on, the focus returned immediately. Miller remained fixed in place, his attention unwavering, while Aaliyah continued to stand as she had from the beginning, unaffected in appearance, though fully aware of the direction the moment was taking. And somewhere beneath the surface of that quiet intersection, the first structural crack in what would soon become a much larger unfolding had already begun to form, unnoticed by everyone except the two people standing at its center. The bus stop had begun to feel less like a temporary waiting point and more like a confined stage where every movement carried unintended weight. The flow of people coming and going continued around 8th Avenue. Yet within the small radius surrounding Deputy Ryan Miller and Aaliyah Carter, time seemed to stretch in a way that made each second more noticeable. Miller had shifted his stance again, now standing slightly closer than before, his attention no longer exploratory but fixed, as though he was trying to resolve a conclusion that had already formed in his mind. Aaliyah remained still, her composure unchanged, her eyes scanning the environment with quiet awareness rather than reaction. The difference between them was not visible in action, but in perception, one interpreting every detail as uncertainty and the other observing without urgency. A nearby commuter glanced toward them while waiting for a bus, then quickly looked away, sensing a tension that did not belong to them. The street noise continued, tires rolling over pavement, distant horns, the low hum of the city operating without interruption, yet the space between Miller and Aaliyah felt increasingly disconnected from that normal rhythm. Miller spoke again, his tone steady but carrying an edge of insistence, as if repetition alone might produce a different outcome. Aaliyah responded without pause, her voice calm, her words controlled, offering only what was necessary to address what was asked while revealing nothing beyond that boundary. There was no sign of frustration in her expression, only patience that felt deliberate rather than passive, a stillness that did not invite escalation but also did not concede ground. Miller briefly glanced toward his radio, then back at her, as if considering procedural steps, though nothing in his behavior suggested certainty had replaced suspicion. The sunlight shifted slightly as clouds passed overhead, altering the tone of the street from bright to muted, and in that change, the environment around them seemed to grow quieter. A bus pulled up at the far end of the stop, doors opening with a mechanical sound, passengers stepping on and off without urgency, unaware of the interaction unfolding only a few feet away. Aaliyah's posture remained unchanged, though her attention subtly tracked the movement around her, not as distraction but as awareness of surroundings. Miller, however, appeared increasingly focused inward, as though narrowing his perspective had become the only path forward. The gap between assumption and understanding had begun to define the space more than any physical distance between them. Aaliyah adjusted her stance slightly again, a natural shift of weight, while Miller interpreted the moment through a lens that continued to harden with each passing second. The bus departed, leaving the stop momentarily quieter, and in that brief silence, the contrast between perception and reality became even more pronounced, as if the world outside the immediate interaction had temporarily faded, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment that was slowly moving toward something neither had yet fully recognized. The space between Deputy Ryan Miller and Aaliyah Carter at the bus stop had settled into a kind of tense stillness that no longer needed movement to feel active, as if the air itself had become a container for every unspoken assumption and every measured response. The city continued its usual rhythm around them, but within that small boundary, the world felt slightly delayed, as though reality had slowed just enough for consequences to begin forming out of sight. Miller stood with his attention locked forward, his posture firm, his presence shaped by procedure and certainty. Yet underneath it, there was a subtle shift that suggested he was no longer simply observing, but trying to define what he was seeing. Aaliyah remained composed, her gaze steady and neutral, her stillness not empty but intentional, like someone who had learned long ago that control often meant choosing when not to react. A few steps behind, a commuter briefly paused, glancing at the interaction before continuing on, their attention pulled away by the flow of their own schedule, unaware that they had just witnessed the early stages of something that would later be dissected and replayed far beyond this street. Miller adjusted his position again, now standing at an angle that narrowed the distance between authority and subject, his voice returning with the same controlled firmness, asking questions that carried more implication than clarity. Aaliyah responded without hesitation, her words calm and precise, offering only direct acknowledgement without expansion, leaving no space for interpretation beyond what was stated. The exchange remained outwardly controlled, yet the imbalance in perception between them continued to deepen, as one side sought confirmation while the other maintained restraint. The hum of passing traffic filled brief gaps in conversation, tires rolling over asphalt, engines fading into distance, yet each pause between words seemed to stretch longer than the last. Miller's focus tightened further, his attention no longer scanning but concentrating, as though narrowing the situation would eventually produce certainty where none had fully formed. Aaliyah shifted her stance slightly, a natural adjustment in balance rather than reaction, her composure unchanged, her presence steady in a way that made urgency feel unnecessary. The environment around them, though unchanged in structure, began to feel subtly redefined by attention, as if everything outside their immediate interaction had been pushed just slightly out of focus. Miller's tone returned once more, steady but increasingly insistent, shaped by a belief that persistence would eventually resolve uncertainty. Aaliyah met each question without deviation, her responses measured, her expression consistent, revealing nothing that extended beyond the present moment. The bus stop lights flickered briefly as a cloud passed overhead, softening the brightness across the pavement, and in that brief change of light, the scene took on a quieter tone, almost suspended. A bus approached in the distance, its sound growing gradually before slowing to a stop nearby, releasing passengers who stepped onto the sidewalk without awareness of the interaction unfolding only a short distance away. Miller remained fixed, his attention unwavering, while Aaliyah continued to stand with the same controlled patience she had maintained from the beginning, as if time itself had no authority over her composure. And in that narrowing space between assumption and reality, the moment continued to evolve quietly, carrying within it the early structure of consequences that had not yet revealed their full shape. The interaction at the bus stop had now settled into a deeper and more defined tension, not through any sudden action, but through the accumulation of observation, restraint, and interpretation that neither side openly acknowledged. Deputy Ryan Miller remained in place, his posture unchanged, yet his attention had become increasingly concentrated, as though the act of questioning alone could shape the outcome he expected. Aaliyah Carter continued to stand with the same calm presence, her expression steady, her movements minimal, each response delivered with precise clarity that offered no room for expansion or misinterpretation. The city around them carried on in its usual rhythm, but within the small radius of their exchange, the sense of normal flow had begun to feel distant, as if the environment itself had narrowed its focus. A few pedestrians moved past the stop, briefly glancing at the scene before continuing on, their attention quickly returning to their own concerns, unaware that the moment they had just passed would later be revisited with far greater significance. Miller adjusted his stance again, his voice returning with a firmer edge, now less exploratory and more directive, as if attempting to anchor the situation into a framework he could control. Aaliyah met each question without hesitation, her tone unchanged, her composure steady, offering answers that remained strictly within the boundaries of what was asked. The rhythm between them had become predictable in structure, but increasingly uneven in meaning, with one side pressing for resolution while the other maintained deliberate restraint. A bus arrived and departed in the background, its movement briefly interrupting the stillness, yet when it left, the quiet returned more pronounced than before. Miller's focus did not waver, his attention now fixed entirely on the interaction, while subtle details in his posture suggested a growing certainty that had not yet been validated by anything concrete. Aaliyah shifted her weight slightly, a natural adjustment that carried no indication of discomfort, only presence, as though she was fully aware of the moment but not influenced by its pressure. The sunlight filtered through passing clouds, changing the tone of the pavement beneath them. And in that shifting light, the contrast between interpretation and reality became more visually distinct, though still unspoken. Miller spoke again, his tone measured but increasingly insistent, attempting to draw clearer boundaries around his assessment of the situation. Aaliyah responded in the same calm manner, her voice steady, her control unbroken, revealing nothing beyond what was necessary to continue the exchange. The surrounding noise of the city softened briefly as traffic lightened at the intersection, creating a brief silence that made every detail more noticeable. In that silence, the interaction appeared less like confrontation and more like a slow unfolding of understanding on one side and controlled restraint on the other. And as that quiet moment extended, it became clear that the situation was no longer simply about presence at a bus stop, but about the gradual formation of consequences that neither participant had yet fully recognized. The stillness at the bus stop had begun to feel less like calm and more like a pressure that built slowly with every passing second, as if the space itself was holding on to something that had not yet been spoken. Deputy Ryan Miller remained positioned near Aaliyah Carter, his stance firm, his attention unwavering, though there was now a subtle shift in the way he observed her, as if the repetition of unanswered certainty was beginning to reshape his focus. Aaliyah stood with the same steady composure, her presence unchanged, her expression calm and unreadable, offering nothing beyond what was necessary to exist within the moment. Around them, the city continued its movement, yet the area around the bus stop felt increasingly separated from that rhythm, like a small circle of stillness surrounded by constant motion. A few more pedestrians passed, one slowing briefly as if sensing something unusual before continuing on, while another adjusted their pace to avoid lingering too close. Miller glanced toward the street and then back at Aaliyah, his attention no longer only on her answers, but on how little they seemed to shift despite his persistence. A bus approached and stopped, releasing a small group of passengers, who stepped into the sidewalk space without acknowledging the interaction unfolding only a short distance away. The doors closed again, and the vehicle moved forward, leaving behind a quieter stretch of air that felt heavier than before. Aaliyah's posture remained unchanged, but her attention subtly expanded outward, tracking movement around her with quiet awareness that never interrupted her calm exterior. Miller's tone returned once more, slightly lower now, shaped less by inquiry and more by controlled insistence, as though maintaining authority required continuous reinforcement. Aaliyah responded with the same measured clarity, each word precise, each pause intentional, never offering more than what was directly required. The balance between them had not shifted visibly, yet something beneath the surface continued to evolve, an unspoken tension formed by contrast rather than confrontation. A passing commuter lifted a phone briefly, not obviously recording, but observing long enough to suggest curiosity had begun to replace indifference in small pockets around them. Miller noticed the movement, his attention flicking momentarily before returning to Aaliyah, his posture tightening slightly as awareness of being observed entered the space between them. The sunlight dimmed again as another cloud moved overhead, softening the edges of the street and flattening the color of the pavement, creating a muted atmosphere that made every detail feel more pronounced. Aaliyah shifted her weight by a fraction, a natural motion that suggested patience rather than response, while Miller adjusted his footing in kind, as if mirroring stability through structure. Neither spoke for a brief moment, and in that silence, the surrounding noise of traffic, footsteps, and distant engines filled the gap without breaking the focus of the interaction. It was in this pause that the situation began to feel less like a moment in transit and more like a point of convergence, where attention, assumption, and timing were slowly aligning into something that had not yet revealed its direction. And although nothing had changed outwardly in what could be seen, the sense that something was approaching continued to grow, quietly embedded in the space between observation and certainty. The atmosphere at the bus stop had shifted again, not through any obvious event, but through a subtle accumulation of attention that now made every small movement feel more significant than before. Deputy Ryan Miller remained close to Aaliyah Carter, his stance controlled, his focus sharpened, as though the interaction had moved beyond routine questioning into something he felt compelled to fully resolve. Aaliyah continued to stand with the same steady composure, her expression unchanged, her presence calm in a way that did not invite interruption or retreat. The city around them maintained its usual flow, buses arriving and departing at regular intervals, pedestrians moving through the sidewalks without pausing. Yet the space around the two of them felt increasingly isolated, as if it had been mentally separated from everything else happening nearby. Miller's attention briefly shifted to the surroundings, noting movement, observing passers-by who glanced and then looked away, their curiosity flickering but never settling. Aaliyah remained still, her awareness extending outward without visible reaction, tracking the environment with quiet precision while maintaining her position. A bus arrived, its doors opening with a mechanical sound that briefly disrupted the stillness, and a few passengers stepped out, walking past without engaging. Yet the moment they passed, the focus returned immediately to the interaction at the center. Miller's posture tightened slightly, not through aggression, but through sustained concentration, as though the repetition of unanswered certainty was beginning to weigh on the structure of his assumptions. Aaliyah's responses, when prompted, remained consistent in tone and clarity, offering only what was necessary, never expanding beyond the immediate question. The rhythm between them had become steady but uneven in meaning, shaped more by perception than by dialogue. A faint shift in the light passed over the street as clouds moved overhead again, softening the edges of the environment and creating a muted tone across the pavement and nearby structures. Aaliyah adjusted her stance subtly, a natural motion that suggested endurance rather than reaction, while Miller's gaze remained fixed, his attention narrowing further as if attempting to isolate certainty within uncertainty. The surrounding noise of traffic and distant movement continued uninterrupted, yet the immediate space felt increasingly self-contained, as if the interaction had formed its own boundary within the larger city. A passing pedestrian slowed for a brief moment, attention drawn to the scene before continuing on, their presence adding to a growing sense that the interaction was no longer invisible to those nearby. Miller noticed the brief attention from others, his expression remaining controlled, though his stance suggested heightened awareness of being observed indirectly. Aaliyah did not acknowledge the change in attention, maintaining her composure without deviation, her focus steady and unbroken. The bus stop, once a simple point of transit, now carried a different weight, defined not by action, but by sustained attention from within and around it. And as the moment extended without resolution, the sense that something was building beneath the surface became increasingly difficult to ignore, though still not yet visible in any direct form. The stillness that had formed around the bus stop was no longer just a background condition of the morning, but something that felt increasingly defined by expectation rather than coincidence. Deputy Ryan Miller remained in place beside Aaliyah Carter, his posture steady, his attention unwavering, though there was now a noticeable shift in how he carried himself, as if the situation had moved beyond simple inquiry into a point where resolution was expected. Aaliyah continued to stand with the same calm composure she had maintained from the beginning, her expression unchanged, her presence quiet but deliberate, offering no reaction that could be interpreted as escalation or retreat. The city continued its movement around them, buses arriving at intervals, pedestrians crossing the sidewalk, distant engines blending into a constant urban rhythm, yet the immediate space between them felt increasingly separated from that flow. Miller briefly scanned the surrounding area again, noticing how attention nearby had subtly increased, with one or two passers-by slowing just enough to observe before continuing on, their curiosity brief but noticeable. Aaliyah remained still, her awareness steady, her focus distributed across the environment without any visible disruption to her composure. The light shifted again as clouds passed overhead, softening the contrast of the street and flattening the reflections on nearby surfaces, giving the entire scene a muted tone that seemed to hold the moment in suspension. Miller's stance tightened slightly, not in overt action but in controlled presence, as though maintaining authority required continuous reinforcement in the absence of clarity. Aaliyah's responses, when prompted, remained consistent, measured, and direct, offering no expansion beyond what was necessary to acknowledge the interaction. The rhythm between them had become predictable in structure, but increasingly uneven in implication, as one side continued to interpret while the other remained unchanged in expression. A bus approached in the distance, its sound growing gradually louder before it slowed to a stop nearby, releasing passengers who stepped onto the sidewalk without pausing to engage, their attention directed elsewhere, unaware of the interaction unfolding only a few feet away. Once the bus departed, the surrounding soundscape returned to its usual balance of traffic and footsteps, yet the immediate area felt even more isolated than before, as if the absence of interruption had intensified focus rather than relieved it. Miller glanced briefly toward his radio, then back at Aaliyah, his attention narrowing further as if attempting to align perception with procedure, though no visible shift in understanding had occurred. Aaliyah adjusted her stance slightly, a natural movement that suggested patience rather than response, her composure remaining constant despite the sustained attention directed toward her. A passing pedestrian slowed momentarily, gaze lingering before continuing forward, contributing to a subtle sense that the interaction was no longer entirely private within the public space. Miller appeared increasingly aware of this indirect observation, his posture remaining controlled but his focus more concentrated than before, as if the presence of outside attention added another layer of weight to the moment. Aaliyah did not react to the change in environment, maintaining her steady presence, her silence carrying the same clarity as her words. And as the moment extended further without resolution, the sense that the situation was approaching a point of transition became more pronounced, though still without any visible indication of what form that transition would take. The environment at the bus stop had reached a point where silence no longer felt like absence of sound, but rather a form of pressure that filled every space between movement and intention. Deputy Ryan Miller stood close to Aaliyah Carter, his posture controlled, his attention now fully concentrated on the interaction in front of him, as if the situation had moved beyond simple observation into something requiring resolution. Aaliyah remained composed in the same position she had held since the beginning, her expression steady, her presence calm and deliberate, offering no indication of discomfort or urgency despite the sustained scrutiny. Around them, the city continued its normal rhythm, buses arriving and departing at measured intervals, pedestrians moving along the sidewalk without pause. Yet the area immediately surrounding them felt increasingly separated from that broader flow, as though attention itself had created an invisible boundary. Miller's gaze shifted briefly toward the street, noting subtle changes in movement as a few individuals slowed slightly while passing, their attention drawn for only a moment before continuing on, but that brief observation added to his awareness that the interaction was no longer entirely unnoticed. Aaliyah did not react to the environment around her, maintaining the same controlled stillness, her focus steady, her responses when prompted remaining precise and unchanged in tone. The light across the street softened again as another layer of cloud moved overhead, reducing contrast and giving the entire scene a muted quality that made every detail feel more deliberate. Miller adjusted his stance once more, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the situation was being continuously evaluated, as if clarity could be achieved through persistence alone. A passing bus slowed at the stop, its doors opening briefly before closing again, releasing a small flow of passengers who moved through the space without engaging, their attention directed elsewhere, unaware of the interaction unfolding only a short distance away. Once the bus departed, the surrounding sound returned to its steady baseline, but the sense of isolation within the immediate area grew stronger rather than weaker. Miller's attention remained fixed, his focus narrowing further as if attempting to align expectation with outcome, though nothing in the interaction had shifted to confirm any conclusion. Aaliyah made a slight adjustment in posture, subtle and natural, her composure unchanged, her silence continuing to function as a form of steady presence rather than absence of response. A few pedestrians in the distance briefly slowed again, glancing toward the bus stop before continuing on, reinforcing a growing sense that the moment had begun to draw attention beyond its original scope. Miller appeared increasingly aware of this indirect observation, his posture still controlled, but his awareness heightened, as if external attention had added another layer of complexity to the situation. Aaliyah remained unaffected by this change, her focus steady, her calmness uninterrupted, her presence consistent in a way that did not invite interpretation beyond what was visible. And as the moment extended further without any visible resolution, the sense of an approaching shift became more pronounced, as though the balance of perception and reality was quietly preparing to reveal something that had not yet taken form. The tension that had been quietly building at the bus stop was no longer something that existed only in subtle gestures or controlled silence, but something that now carried a sense of approaching resolution, as if the moment itself had reached a threshold where perception could no longer remain unchanged. Deputy Ryan Miller stood in place beside Aaliyah Carter, his posture still controlled, yet his attention now fully fixed, as though the accumulation of time and observation had led him to a point where certainty felt imminent even without confirmation. Aaliyah remained steady, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, standing with the same calm presence that had defined her from the beginning of the interaction, offering nothing beyond what the moment required. The city around them continued its motion, buses arriving and departing, pedestrians moving through intersections, distant traffic maintaining its constant rhythm, yet the immediate space between them felt increasingly isolated, as if the surrounding environment had been reduced to background noise. Miller's focus tightened further, his gaze locked on Aaliyah, while his stance reflected a subtle shift from inquiry toward expectation, as though he believed the next moment would finally provide clarity. Aaliyah's silence remained consistent, not as absence of response, but as controlled presence, her attention distributed across the environment in a way that suggested awareness without disruption. A bus approached and stopped, releasing a small group of passengers who stepped into the sidewalk space, briefly intersecting with the scene before continuing on without pause, their attention never lingering long enough to alter the moment unfolding beside them. When the bus moved on, the surrounding sound softened again, and the sense of separation between the interaction and the rest of the city became even more pronounced. Miller adjusted his position slightly, his posture still disciplined, but now carrying the weight of anticipation, as if the structure of the situation was nearing its final form. Aaliyah made a minimal shift in stance, natural and unforced, maintaining her calm presence without reacting to the growing intensity of attention. A few pedestrians in the distance slowed again, their brief glances suggesting curiosity that had now become more frequent, though still cautious and indirect. Miller appeared increasingly aware of this external observation, his awareness expanding beyond the immediate exchange, as though the presence of witnesses added another dimension to the unfolding moment. Aaliyah did not acknowledge the change, remaining composed, her silence steady, her presence unchanged despite the subtle increase in attention surrounding her. The light across the street softened once more as clouds passed overhead, muting reflections and flattening contrast, giving the entire scene a subdued tone that emphasized stillness over motion. And within that stillness, the interaction continued to hold its shape without resolution, yet with a growing sense that what had been building beneath the surface was approaching a point where it could no longer remain contained or unrecognized. The stillness at the bus stop had finally reached a point where it no longer felt like a continuation of waiting, but rather the final stretch of something that had been building long before either of them acknowledged it. Deputy Ryan Miller stood in place beside Aaliyah Carter, his posture still controlled, but now carrying a different weight, as if the accumulation of time and observation had led him to a moment where certainty was about to take shape. Aaliyah remained steady, her expression unchanged, her composure unbroken, standing with the same calm presence that had defined her from the beginning. The city continued to move around them, buses arriving and departing, pedestrians crossing intersections, distant engines blending into a constant background rhythm. Yet the immediate space between them felt completely separated from that flow. Miller's attention tightened, his gaze fixed, his focus no longer exploratory but expectant, as if waiting for something he could not yet define but instinctively recognized as near. Aaliyah's silence remained consistent, her presence deliberate, her awareness calm and distributed, unaffected by the growing attention around her. A bus approached and stopped nearby, releasing passengers who stepped into the sidewalk space, briefly intersecting the moment before continuing on without pause, their attention directed elsewhere, unaware of the significance forming only a few feet away. When the bus moved on, the surrounding sounds softened again, and the silence that followed felt deeper than before, as though it had absorbed everything unnecessary and left only the essential tension behind. Miller adjusted his stance slightly, his posture still disciplined, but now shaped by anticipation rather than inquiry. Aaliyah made a subtle shift in position, natural and unforced, maintaining her steady composure without reacting to the shift in energy around her. A few pedestrians in the distance slowed briefly, their attention drawn more frequently now, as though something about the interaction had begun to register beyond ordinary curiosity. Miller appeared aware of this indirect attention, his awareness expanding beyond Aaliyah alone, as if the presence of observation itself was becoming part of the situation he was trying to interpret. Then, without warning in tone but decisive in effect, Miller's attention broke slightly as he looked toward his radio, pausing for a moment that felt longer than it was. A brief exchange of communication followed, too quiet to be fully heard, but enough to change the atmosphere immediately. His expression shifted subtly, not in reaction, but in recognition, as if information had arrived that did not align with the assumptions he had been forming. Aaliyah did not move, did not speak, did not acknowledge the change, remaining exactly as she had been, calm and composed, her presence steady as ever. Miller looked back at her, his focus now altered, less certain, more measured, as if recalibrating everything he had assumed since the beginning of the interaction. In the distance, another vehicle slowed near the intersection, and for a brief moment, the environment felt unusually still, as though even the city's motion had softened in response to what was unfolding. And in that silence, the structure of the moment shifted completely, no longer defined by suspicion or interpretation, but by the beginning of realization that what had been present all along was not what it appeared to be. The moment at the bus stop had reached its final turning point, where silence no longer functioned as absence, but as confirmation that something had already shifted beyond interpretation. Deputy Ryan Miller stood facing Aaliyah Carter, his posture no longer defined by routine control, but by a visible recalibration of understanding, as though the structure of the situation he had been holding in place was no longer valid. Aaliyah remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, steady, composed, her expression unchanged, her presence calm in a way that did not seek attention yet could not be ignored. The city around them continued its movement, buses passing, pedestrians crossing, distant traffic maintaining its rhythm, but none of it seemed to reach the space they occupied, which now felt entirely separated from its surroundings. Miller lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, his attention no longer fixed on suspicion, but on recognition forming slowly through restraint and procedure. A small shift in his stance signaled a change that was not spoken aloud, as though the foundation of his earlier assumptions had been replaced by something verified but unexpected. Aaliyah did not move, did not react, maintaining the same quiet composure that had defined her throughout the entire encounter, her silence now carrying a different weight, one that no longer needed explanation. In the distance, a bus passed without stopping, its sound fading quickly, leaving behind a deeper stillness that seemed to settle into the space between them. Miller's attention briefly shifted toward his radio once more, then away, as if confirming information that could no longer be questioned, and when he looked back at Aaliyah, his expression had fully changed, not in emotion, but in understanding. The presence of any remaining uncertainty had dissolved, replaced by a recognition that altered the entire structure of the moment they had been standing in. Aaliyah finally spoke, her voice calm and steady, not elevated, not defensive, simply clear, and in that brief exchange, the imbalance that had defined the interaction from the beginning no longer held its shape. Around them, the city resumed its natural rhythm, pedestrians continuing forward, unaware of the full weight of what had just shifted at the bus stop, yet the space itself no longer carried tension, only resolution. Miller stepped slightly back, his posture still controlled, but now neutral, as though the situation had been formally reclassified in his mind. Aaliyah remained for a brief moment longer, composed as ever, before the natural flow of the environment reclaimed attention from both of them. And as she finally moved forward, merging back into the city without urgency or spectacle, what remained at the bus stop was not conflict or suspicion, but the quiet aftermath of realization that truth had been present the entire time, waiting only for recognition.